QSO Today episode 253, Glenn Johnson, W0GJ. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, and are ready to enhance your contest season beginning with ARRL Field Day in a few weeks. And by QRP Labs, Hans Summer G0UPL's QRP Radio Kit Company. Hans has an amazing catalog of radio kits and parts for every budget. I want to thank both ICOM and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, W0GJ, your host. One of the better-known DXpeditioners, fellow hams that travel to the far corners of the earth to give DXers a rare entity, is my guest today, Glenn Johnson, W0GJ. Glenn began his ham radio journey as a teenager, and from his love for chasing DX has since been to many DX entities around the world, including Herd Island, an attempt last year to land on Bouvet Island, and an upcoming DXpedition later this year to Pitcairn Island. Glenn's interest and determination to provide these rare DX entities along with his DXpedition group is worth the weeks at sea, sometimes in terrible conditions. I'm grateful that Glenn has been able to break from his preparations for Pitcairn to spend this QSO today. W0GJ, this is Eric, W0GJ. Are you there, Glenn?
I am, W0GJ from Whiskey Zero Golf Juliet.
Glenn, what a great pleasure it is to have you on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started actually as an adolescent. My grandfather had an old Philco radio in his basement, and I would go down and when I would visit my grandfather, who actually was our neighbor, and listen to shortwave radio. And I was mostly fascinated. It was 40 meters. I could hear hams talking to one another, and sometimes I could only hear part of the conversation. It always piqued my interest as to who these guys were, and they could talk all over the world and talk about anything. So that's what started my interest in ham radio, was my grandfather's shortwave radio. And then as a teenager, about age 15, I really got interested, and it was actually when I was 15 years old is when I passed my test, but I was 16 by the time my license arrived 2 or 3 months later. And that was a novice license. And I had a little Johnson Adventure transmitter, was my first transmitter. I thought it had 50 watts. I still have that transmitter, and if something has died in it, in the last couple of years, I've seen it only puts out about 20 watts. So it really wasn't a 50-watt transmitter at all. Maybe that was the input. And then I had an RME receiver, and in about 3.5 months, I worked all 50 states. And then passed my general test.
Your grandfather helped you get the interest in amateur radio. What was the hometown, and were there a lot of hams there? And so who helped you get that first license?
Well, we lived in the country in central Iowa, in the rural area, and it was Marshalltown, Iowa, in the very center of the state of Iowa. And I really didn't know anyone, and I just... somewhere I found a book. It was in the high school library, and I wrote to the ARRL, and they sent me some information, and I ended up getting a study guide, and I learned the Morse code myself. I found a little oscillator and a tape recorder and would record code groups so I wouldn't know what was coming, and that's how I taught myself Morse code. And then I've heard of a ham in town and called him and said, I want to take my novice test. And he said he thought I was starting from scratch. And I said, no, I'm ready to take the test. And so he gave me the test. I passed it, and a few months later got my license in the mail.
Did this ham in your town become a mentor to you? Did you have mentors as a 16-year-old novice?
You know, he helped me a little bit. He helped me put up my first antenna, but I had designed it. Basically, it was just a wire dipole from the top of the house out into some trees. So I really didn't have a good Elmer. He did help me. So I pretty much was a self-starter, self-learner, everything, all the way up through the advanced test. It was totally on my own reading and studying, and that's how I got started. I didn't really have a good Elmer.
Was there a ham radio club in Marshalltown?
There was, but I didn't know of it until I had actually been on the air. And one of my first contacts was a local kid in town my same age, and he invited me to the ham club, and that's how I first knew about it after I was on the air. And then I remember as a new kid, this was at the time when Bob Dennison, W0DX, was president of the ARRL, and he lived in a town just a few miles from me, and he had a lumber yard and a hatchery where you could buy little chickens, baby chickens, and he would come every month, and he would have usually some very interesting guests from all over the world. And I thought, wow, this is really kind of neat. And at the time, I didn't realize or appreciate that the president of the ARL was in my neighborhood and attending my local ham club meetings. So, and that's kind of what started me in DX. One of my first contacts was with, I called CQ on 15 meters once, and a UB5 called me in Ukraine. And I thought, this is too cool. First of all, I couldn't figure out his call because I was expecting a W or N or K call, or I guess a W or K call at that time. And that's really what got me started in DXing.
Did your high school have a radio club?
No, I had a very small school, and there was no radio club. There was a radio club in the Marshalltown school, but I went to a small town called LeGrand, and there were like 40 kids in my graduating class. So we had a pretty small school.
Earlier you mentioned that you got really interested in contesting. How did that start? I mean, what's the motivation for that if you don't have a lot of input from the other hams?
Well, again, I listened, and I heard a contest or two, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And there were probably one or two people that were kind enough to stop and tell me, we're making as many contacts as we can. This was happened to be in sideband. And I don't even remember what month or what contest it was. And he said, you just, make as many contacts. And where do you live? Well, you give this report. And so I made, several dozen contacts all over. And it was such a thrill. And I had, at least initially as a novice, I had pretty limited crystals. I had like 3 crystals. One worked on 80, 2 on 40, and one of the 40 worked on the 15 band. So I was pretty rock bound, as they said in those days. And I was able to do a lot with CW. And then later on, when the contest bug hit me, I finally joined the ARRL about a year after I had my license and got QST and saw the contest schedules. And then I started participating in those, and that's kind of what started up my contest interest.
And that seems to be a very strong foundation then for what you did later in amateur radio?
Yes, it certainly was.
What was your first call sign?
Whiskey November 0, Papa Uniform Juliet. And then as a general, it was WA0PUJ. And I kept that until about 1996 or 7 when the second round of vanity calls came out, and W0GJ for my initials was my first choice, and that's what I ended up with, luckily.
Now, you mentioned your first rig, which was the Johnson Adventure transmitter. What's an RME receiver?
It's Radio Manufacturing Engineers, and they made a pretty high-quality receiver. And I found this. There was a neighbor a few miles away that after I got my license, this was not my novice test giver, but he had a old receiver that he let me borrow, and it was an Army 6900. And I borrowed that receiver, and I liked it so much that I ended up buying one, and with the allowance that I had saved up, and I spent all of my allowance on that receiver, and I was so proud of that receiver, and it was a good one for the time anyway.
Now, does that receiver sit in your desk on your novice station today, along with the Johnson Adventure?
It does. It sits on my desk, and for straight key night, I fire things up and use it.
I'm going to refer the listeners to your QRZ page where a picture of that station is on display, and it's really cool.
For me, it was back in, this was in the 60s, and there was no internet, no cell phone. Long distance calls were always expensive, and it was the magic of radio and it still fascinates me today, the magic that, we can communicate through the airwaves with just some parts we put together and make contacts. That's been the fascination of ham radio for my whole life. It's just been that magic and fun that we can have, and you never know where your next contact is coming from. It's just a real thrill.
As a teenager, were you a builder or electronic experimenter?
A little bit. It was more mechanical things. It wasn't, I built some little circuit board kits. I built an oscillator. That was probably the first thing I built to help get my code speed up to 13 and then 20 words a minute.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
I'll say yes and no. Of course, I wanted to be an electrical engineer, so I went to Iowa State University and enrolled in electrical engineering, and I had a tough first quarter, and I was a little bit discouraged. I enjoyed the math, but some of the engineering it just didn't jive with me. And I took my counselor had me take an interest finding test, and believe it or not, forestry was by far and away the highest fit for me, and I'd never even thought of that at all. And so I switched my major to forestry and graduated in forestry, and enjoyed that immensely. I had some very wonderful summer jobs in forestry.
But you weren't in forestry very long. It seems to me that somehow your education took a turn.
I was going to graduate school at Penn State University in forestry, working with remote sensing. That would be satellite imaging. This is way before Google Earth. And I had a cousin that was a doctor, and he talked to me and said, "You really need to go to medical school." And I hadn't even thought of it at all. And I inquired in the local college, and I found out that the deadline for taking the medical college admissions test was like a week later. And so I put my application in and took the test, and make a long story short, before I knew it, I got accepted into medical school. And that was at the University of Iowa. I did that for 4 years. And then I had an internship at the University of Washington in Seattle. And then I went to Rochester, Minnesota at the Mayo Clinic to do my residency in orthopedic surgery.
Well, that's quite a turn.
I met my wife in medical school. We had a date. To make a long story short, it was a blind date to start with. And one time she was in my room and saw my radio and asked what that was. And I said, "Oh, that's my magic radio where I talk all over the world. I just had a little wire strung out from the medical fraternity house." And I showed it to her, and she was so impressed. She actually got her license.
Before she married you?
It was just shortly right after we were married. She was studying for the test at the time we got married. And her call was Whiskey November 0, Quebec, India, Germany. She called it Quiet Innocent Girl. And a few months later, after she got her code speed up and studied, she went with a van load of guys to Des Moines, where you still had in those days, you still had to go to the FCC examiners to take exams. She went with a van load of guys, and she was the only one that passed her test. She said it was one of the most quietest rides back. It was about a 2-hour drive, but she was the only one that passed her code and written theory. And then she was WB0QIG. And then after my residency at the Mayo Clinic, to backtrack a little bit, in the height of the Vietnam War, my draft number was 6. The year they drafted draft numbers that went up to 350 or so. Right.
This was a lottery that was operational during the Vietnam War. For those people who are too young to remember the draft.
That's correct. And my choice was either to be drafted out of college and be in the infantry, or get into the ROTC program and be an officer when I came out. And I got put in the Air Force ROTC, and after I graduated from college, I got a deferment for medical school because they needed doctors. And then after medical school, I got another deferment for orthopedic surgery to finish my orthopedic residency because that was the most critical need in the military at the time. So I put off my Vietnam commitment for many years, 4 plus 5, that would be 9 years. And so I was probably the last of the Vietnam draftees to see active duty after there was no more Vietnam War. And then I was in the Air Force for 5 years and then came back to Minnesota to practice. And during that time we were in Alaska, they had assigned all of the KL7 2x2 calls except for the Ys. And when we first arrived in Alaska, they were issuing KL7 Y, C, or D. And at that time, based upon your location, your physical location, you could get a call sign change. And so Vivian put her application in to have her call sign changed to a KL7, and she got KL7YL. So it's not a vanity call, but she's very proud of her KL7YL call sign.
And she's kept it all these years.
She has.
And now this message from ICOM America. With the Dayton Hamvention in the past, we are moving quickly to the ARRL Field Day and contest season. Take the ICOM IC9700 along on your field day to work VHF-UHF modes, including single sideband and CW, and the digital modes. Why not demonstrate moon bounce or meteor scatter to your assembled club? The IC9700 is ICOM's newest SDR transceiver that is fully operational in all modes on VHF, UHF, and 1.2 GHz. This full-featured rig includes color touchscreen, RF direct sampling on 2 meters and 70 centimeters, and independent dual receivers capable of duplex operation on your favorite passing satellite. Power output on 2 meters is 100 watts, 75 watts on UHF, and 10 watts maximum on 1.2 GHz. Of course, this rig can be remote controlled over the Internet with an optional Ethernet interface and software from ICOM. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants both in his shack and on his field day site. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that will change the world's definition of a software SDR transceiver. This rig, too, has independent dual receivers, allowing you to be ready to pounce on DX or contest stations in one band while working another. Finally, the ICOM IC7300 has changed the definition of the entry-level HF transceiver. This compact footprint that almost exactly matches the IC9700 also includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, and real-time spectrum scope or pan adapter. ICOM America has the rig for your field day tent or ham radio shack that matches every amateur radio operator's level, skill set, and ability. Be sure to visit your favorite ham radio store to take a look at these fine rigs in action. Click the ICOM image on this week's show notes page to get to the ICOM America website. I want to thank ICOM for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Remember, when you buy your next ICOM rig, please be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. Are you saying that in Alaska that there's so many hams that the KL7AA all the way through ZZ were already assigned?
They were, except the Ys had been reserved for some reason. Huh. And then after that, then there were the KL7 ABCs, the 2x3s.
Right, amazing. So it was the Air Force that kind of drove you towards orthopedics? Or the Air Force need? Was that an interest that you developed along the way?
That was an interest I developed along the way, orthopedics, and if I would have been in family medicine or some other specialty, I would have seen active duty after medical school. But the military needed more orthopedic surgeons, as that was a critical shortage. So I got another deferment for orthopedic training.
And ham radio you were an active ham radio operator this entire time through school?
During medical school and residency, I was semi-active. I would get on periodically. I usually had a station or at least a radio I could listen to. And sometimes I would go home to contest because I had better equipment, and home was um, in medical school was an hour and a half away. And then when I was after I was married and out of student housing, when I was a resident in Rochester, I had a house, and I had a little tower and a beam, so I would contest from home then. But I wasn't really active and didn't chase a lot of DX, and basically I was out of. I missed one sunspot cycle as far as DXing goes during my medical school and residency training. And then when we were up in Alaska, we had a house and a beam, and that was at the very, very bottom of the sunspot cycle. And about every Sunday afternoon, you could work some JAs, and about every other Sunday afternoon, you could work into the West Coast. So being that high latitude at the very bottom of the sunspot cycle was pretty dismal in those days.
Right. You probably felt quite isolated out there, even as a ham radio operator.
Yeah, yes, there was a very active Anchorage Amateur Radio Club that we both participated in, and we helped with communications during the Iditarod sled dog race. That was always a highlight every year.
And you supplied communications to the Iditarod sled dog race?
Correct.
Do you have a favorite operating mode?
Yes, all. I like, early on I was pretty weighted into sideband. And as I needed to work more DX, CW became more important. And on a DXpedition now, I prefer CW. I'm not the fastest op. I just like to coast along at 28, 30 words a minute. I'm not a really fast op, but that's a very comfortable speed for me. And I've always liked RIDI, and now FT8. So I really don't have a favorite mode. I like them all.
So, but if you want to relax in an evening after a hard day at the orthopedic practice, what will you turn on? Well,
now my interest has been a lot in FT8 and 6 meters, and working grids and states. And last summer there was an opening, and I don't even think I'd worked Canada on 6 meters. And there was an opening to Asia and the Caribbean, and my country count is something like 20 or 22 now on 6 meters. And boy, that really piqued my interest, with FT8. It couldn't have been done in any other mode.
You have numerous awards working QRP on 160 meters. which I read that and I said, wow, that blows me away. What advice would you give to a ham that wants to work QRP on 160 meters?
The secret is good antennas.
Like the antennas you have now, or were you working in more modest conditions?
Well, my first win, if you want to put it that way, was when I lived in northern Minnesota, and I had a single full-size vertical for 160. It was a Roan 25G tower with an with insulators at 25 feet and elevated radials. And that was really a good antenna system. And when we moved to Iowa 5 or 6 years ago, I doubled that. I put up two full-size verticals and a half wavelength apart, so I can beam broadside or end fire. And with to win a contest, sometimes there's a lot of competition, and you need to pick your sweet spot. And living on the East Coast, you can work Europe. On the West Coast, you can work Asia. With QRP, the East Coast can't work the West Coast. Here in the Midwest, in the middle of the country with 5 watts, you can work both coasts. And occasionally I'll get 4 or 5 Caribbean countries. But amazingly, every year in the ARL 160 contest QRP, I'm able to work Hawaii and Alaska every year. And I think my record time was something like just under 11 hours to work all 50 states QRP on 160. And, that is a real thrill to be able to do that.
Okay, but when you're talking, I'm going back a second here because I'm trying to just digest what you just said. You're saying you're operating an electrically quarter wave vertical on 160, or you were in Minnesota. Is that right? Are you saying that you had a tower that was 40 meters high?
Yes, it was. That's right.
You see, 40.
And then now
I have to convert that to feet somehow. That's over 100 feet high, right?
153 feet.
Right. Okay.
Is how tall the tower is when you consider the elevated base, how high that is above the ground. The radiation part is like 128 or 129 feet plus 25 feet plus.
And you were loading the tower, or you had a vertical radial running down the side of the tower.
I had the tower itself was on insulators, so the tower itself was the radiating part, and all the guys were Philly strand, and I had 4 downward sloping elevated radials, just like a ground plane, like you'd build for 2 meters, but it was for 160.
Okay, so for all of those people there that were waiting to hear a secret revealed that this was done with a G5 RV hanging on the roof at about 20 meters above the ground, this is not the case here.
It is not the case here.
Okay, so the secret is always the antenna. If there's a bottom line to the QSO Today podcast in this episode, the antenna is always the secret sauce.
Yes, and radios today, in the last 20, even 30 years, all of these radios are good. And you start slicing and dicing, and you go to the laboratory tests and see so many dB this and separation that. Every radio in the last 20 years, 30 years has been really, really good. And the secret to it's not the equipment. It's like driving a car. Everybody has their preference and their arrangement of knobs and dials and things. But to get out, you need to radiate, and that takes an antenna. And then a lot of the skill involved in making good scores and contests or working DX is between the ears. It's the skills involved in the antennas. The radios are basically tertiary or third or fourth down the line. That's not the first thing, but that's what's, if you look at the advertisements, that's what they lead you to believe, is that the radio is the most important thing.
That's true. That they do that, don't they? What's your favorite contest?
The ARRL 160, because that's one I can win. And then until the hurricane wiped out Jody's antennas in Turks and Caicos, VP5JM, I have been down there since the mid 1990s, working the ARRL sideband contest in the first weekend in March, and I have 17 first place world or first place North America in the single op, or sometimes we'd do a multi-single. In the last few years, I would do a QRP. My favorite QRP rig is a Flex 1500, and that's what I do the 160 contest with, and what I've taken with me the last few years down to Turks and Caicos. So, its location, its antennas, and, QRP can go a long ways. With minimal antennas, it's really tough, QRP.
Now, the station that you have is, and I'll refer again to your QRZ page, but you've got kind of a completely glass dashboard for your station. Do you want to describe it a little bit?
There's 3 big monitors, and that's my station. There's a microphone sitting off the side that rarely gets used, but there's a key that gets used, and a keyboard for FT8. Several years ago, I went Flex, and I have behind and underneath my desk is a Flex 6700 and the Flex PGXL amplifier, and there's no knobs or anything. Everything is totally out of the way, and all my antenna switching is automatic. I have the Flex Antenna Genius, which the amplifier, the antenna selector, and the radio all plug into the network, and they all shake hands, and all of the audio for FT8 is it's all digital channels, digital cables, so there's really no wiring. It's very simple. There's no feedback loops. It's very effective, and it's fun. It's just a different experience than a radio with knobs. I have on the other side of the shack, I have a set of Collins gear that I always drooled over as a kid. And when I was a ham for 50 years, I found an estate sale, and there was this beautiful Collins gear for sale, and I said, I'll take it. And for a fair price, I acquired a very nice Collins station, and I use that every day when I'm home. I check into the Iowa net, and I rag chew with some friends almost every morning on the other set of Collins.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. I saw lots of Collins gear there. So you have the Collins S line, but what are some of the other pieces that you're the most proud of in your Collins group?
Well, I have the 75S3C and the 32S3 and a 30L1 amplifier. And that's usually my rag chew. And if I do any DXing with it, that's the radio I use. And then I have a KWM2A with the remote VFO and a 30L1. And then I also have a 51S1, which is a general coverage HF receiver that I listen to actually quite a bit. If I'm doing some studying or writing a paper or reading, I'll have that turned down low to maybe a broadcast, a shortwave broadcast, or just some ham frequencies I'm listening to. So I use them almost every day when I'm home. It's a rare day they don't get used.
Well, how do you choose? I mean, it seems like you could be frustrated from too much choice in your shack.
Well, I kind of have them set up, where I operate on each one, so I don't change bands a lot. I have every antenna that I have comes into the shack, and there's an AB switch, and so I can the A always goes to the flex radio, and then I have some switches that will choose a B antenna for the S lines, and I can pick off any antenna to use with the S line. So it really works pretty slick. So it's very flexible.
And you have some automation that interlocks the radio so they don't transmit into no load if there's no antenna connected?
Correct.
You're a consummate DXpeditioner, and you can tell just by if you go to a number of the DXpedition sites, your call sign is there. How did that start for you?
I've always been interested in DX, and I had a pretty high total early on and did a lot of contesting. And in 1996, I was asked to join the Bouvet Island VK0IR DXpedition. And we all had assignments, and so I took an assignment. It was I was the clean czar, how we would get water and how we would use toilet facilities and how we would prepare our food and everything safely. And, everybody had some responsibility, but that was my niche in that. And so I got to know these guys, and one thing led to another. And I've always been interested in the Kingdom of Bhutan. And a couple of years later, I started organizing trying to get into Bhutan. There was no ham radio allowed at the time. There had been previously, but then Bhutan came along, and to make a long story short, we were able to operate. And I had been doing getting ready to do some work in Bhutan professionally with Orthopedics Overseas, which is like Doctors Without Borders. And so I've been to Bhutan many times working, and usually our assignments are a month or more. And so I take my radio and set up there. And the first time I was there with Orthopedics Overseas, our whole family went, and we homeschooled our kids, by the way. And we all had Bhutan licenses and operated from our little apartment and with a good antenna. We homeschooled our 4 kids. And part of science was ham radio. And so all the kids passed their test. I remember my oldest son was 5 years old when he sat down to take the technician class, and they were still doing the code test at that time. And I remember one of the proctors said, "Is he old enough to read?" And he could, and he passed the test with flying colors, and then took the code test, and he passed that with flying colors. And all the kids, I think the youngest Mark was 5, and I think the oldest was 9 when they got their licenses. And all but one are extra class, and I have 2 married kids, and their spouses are now hams too. And they're all extra class except for my youngest daughter.
And are they all active?
We've done a lot of contesting together. Just at home, we have a contest call for our Johnson Joules. That's Joules, Johnson Joules Contest Club, N1JJ. Mm-hmm. And we've done a lot of contesting from our home. And then when we've been overseas, and I've taken the kids to the Caribbean and do some contesting from there, and let them operate until they drop, and then I'll take over until they're refreshed again to operate. So they've all done a lot of contesting. The oldest kids, I'd say right now the kids aren't really too active. My oldest daughter recently had, there'll be 4 this summer, but a set of triplets to go with her 18-month-old. So there's basically 4 kids less than 5. So she's quite busy.
So she can be forgiven if she's not on the air very much. I can only imagine.
and my daughter-in-law has a newborn to go with their 4-year-old, so she's quite busy too. And my son works for Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab near Baltimore, and he gets on the club station periodically to work some DX.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Well, you've hit the mother load in terms of family interest in ham radio. Is there a secret to that? I mean, do you? We're taking a side here, but I think it's an important question for all of us who, for some reason, were never able to sell ham radio to the rest of our family. Do you think it was the homeschooling?
Did we force it on them? Maybe we did, but I think they always saw my enthusiasm and competitive spirit for contesting. And I think that's, yeah. I think my wife and I and most of our kids are pretty type A and competitive, and I think that's what has drawn us to this. So, it's just been a fun sport, for the family.
So let's go back to Herd Island then for just a moment, and that is you're the clean czar. It also, you probably were the physician on staff, right, for that DXpedition?
Correct. Yep.
Just for those of us that don't know a lot about DXpeditions, generally this is what you're trying to get when you're trying to put together a team, is to have a complementary skill set of skills in order to be successful on a whole bunch of different fronts, not just operating. Is that correct?
Right. You're so isolated. And on this trip, the ship dropped us off, and then 3 weeks later came back. So we were totally isolated without any medical or even evacuation possibilities at all. I mean, we were on our own. And Herd Island is very windy. And one of the first days, it might have been the second day we were there setting up, the wind, which is very strong there, blew a lid off a container and caught someone's arm and dislocated their shoulder. And oftentimes, if you put a shoulder back in right away, you don't need any anesthetic or anything, and that's what happened. And whenever I see this person on the air, I ask how the shoulder. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So it really is good to have some medical help when you're on some of these expeditions. That's probably the biggest thing that I've done. I've fixed a few lacerations and maybe given a few medicines for somebody that might be sick or ailing in some way or another. But that's really the only big emergency that I've had on a DXpedition. Well,
it seems to me that an orthopedic surgeon is probably a big asset, probably more than a urologist. My apologies to any urologists out there.
Well, I tell everybody I'm just a mechanic. I'm not a real doctor. If you're sick, you're in real trouble if you see me.
But there's a joke. I don't remember it, but there's a apparently the medical profession has a joke about about orthopedic surgeons being strong as bulls?
Strong as an ox and twice as smart.
There you go. You attempted to land on Bouvet Island last year. Your group, the Bouvet DXpedition group, attempted to land on Bouvet Island last year, the number 2 most wanted DX entity. We all felt your pain. I was following it and watching your the video that was coming back from the island as you guys were circling it. But you had to scuttle the mission because of bad weather and engine failures to the ship. Apparently the captain decided there was enough, and then you headed back to South Africa. You've spoken at length about Bouvet, so we don't need to go into all the details here, but you compared it on your QRZ page to Apollo 13 as a quote-unquote success failure. What is that comparison?
Well, Apollo 13 went to the moon, and an oxygen tank exploded, and they lost power, and they had to jury rig some things, and they basically slingshotted around the moon and made it back to Earth and landed safely. So it was a successful failure, successful in that everybody survived, but a failure that the mission was not accomplished. So that pretty much is like the 3Y0Z Bouvet DXpedition. We all made it back alive, and that was a success. The failure was that we didn't get to activate the island. And the engine failure or the drive shaft failure, in normal seas, normal subtropical seas, that would not have been a problem. But with one engine, one prop, the captain was having great difficulty keeping or holding position in the severe winds we had. And if something else would fail, we'd be absolutely helpless. And there's nobody around for thousands of miles. And so he did make the wise decision to abort and go back. In fact, going back with reduced power, just in case something else happened, into the wind, into the current, we made very, very slow progress back toward Chile. And after 24 hours, it was obvious that we had to go downwind and down current. And so we headed to South Africa at a very, very slow pace. So, we were really prepared. What we learned about Bouvet is that it's a very, very dangerous place. And the winds are horrible, and the storms too. And the same thing with, was it 3Y0I, Dom's DXpedition? They experienced basically the same thing, with ship troubles during the winds. And maybe the third time will be the charm. I hope so. It's a very dangerous, those Southern ocean QTHs are very, very dangerous. And I have a much, much greater appreciation for those. And I learned that on Heard Island, 20 years ago. The winds, I remember before Heard Island, I was at Dayton early in the year before we left. And there were two guys that had been on Heard Island before, Jim Smith, VK9NS. And I asked Jim, I said, what's your advice about Heard Island? He said, the wind will kill you. And then there was also K8CW who had been to Heard Island. And I asked him, I said, what would be your advice? And he said exactly the same thing. The wind will kill you. And, it's just, it's not a...
It's a desert island, so there's no windbreak from trees or anything like that.
And just the climate of the southern oceans, there are hurricanes or cyclones in that part of the world that are just circling Antarctica all the time. And if you look at windyty.com, WINDTY.com, and then look at the southern oceans, it's just one cyclone after another, just circling Antarctica. And that's what will kill you there, is the wind.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Now you took a picture of an iceberg that appears online, and it looks like a shelf, maybe 10 meters high, maybe more, off in the distance. I mean, this is a moving island that you have to deal with as well. What was the danger to the ship if you got too close to one of these things?
Well, they're only 10% above the water. That iceberg that is on my website was about 3/4 of a mile long, and it probably would have been easier to land there because it would have been flat, and we could have done an iota. That's an iceberg on the air. but there were little icebergs all the time, bumping against the ship, and you could hear them. It's like slush basically. But if we'd lost a radar, and I think that's why Dom's DXpedition turned around, they lost their radar and couldn't see the obstructions in the icebergs, which is very critical in that part of the world.
You have the upcoming Pitcairn Island coming up in October 2019. Where is Pitcairn, and what's there now?
As a kid, I remember reading about the mutiny on the Bounty, and the mutineers settled on Pitcairn Island. And even as a new ham, I would listen in the evenings to Tom Christian, VP. It wasn't VP 6 then, but Tom Christian I would listen to, and some of the other Pitcairners on the island talk and work pileups. And so I have always known about Pitcairn, but it's very remote. And back in the 1790s, when the mutiny occurred, Pitcairn Island was plotted on the maps, but 200 miles off from where it really is. And it was just because of the difficulty in keeping latitude correct because of the timepieces at the time. But if you draw a line from the Panama Canal to Auckland, New Zealand, Pitcairn is about halfway and only 4 miles off of that straight line. So the closest landfall might be Easter Island to the southeast, and the very southeastern parts of Tahiti, French Polynesia to the northwest. So it's very isolated, and it's an old rugged volcano. There's no flat area. There's no airport, and even ships. There's no wharf for ships to dock. Only small ships in one small harbor. So all the ships have to be met by longboats out on the ocean.
So your ship will anchor off the coast, and you'll be shuttled back and forth with longboats?
We're taking the Braveheart from an island called Manangariva. We all fly to Papeete, Tahiti. Then we fly from there to Mangariva, and then it's a 32, 34-hour boat ride to Pitcairn. And then the longboats meet us and take us ashore with our gear.
When we were corresponding to set up this QSO Today interview, you were just finishing the packaging and shipping of equipment to Pitcairn. How much equipment are you sending there?
We have a 20-foot container that's about half full as far as height goes, but it's packed tightly the bottom half. I don't know what the weight or tonnage is, but it's we have enough for 9 stations. There's 14 operators. We have enough for 9 stations. One is an EME station. We have commercial power from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. commercial, if you call that commercial, on Pitcairn. That's when the generator runs. And then Nigel of the Braveheart, the ship we're taking, has generators that we're going to use when the power is off. And we'll be staying at the home of Andrew Christian, which is at the second highest point on Pitcairn. So we'll be about 1,000 feet above sea level with a really good takeoff. So we'll have 2 sites. We'll have some use of the old radio site, which is the highest point on the island, and then which is maybe 1,000 meters away from Andrew Christian's home. So we'll have two separate operating sites. So we'll be quite busy, I think.
Are there lessons from Bouvet that you and the team are applying to the Pitcairn DXpedition?
I think it's being slim and trim as far as equipment goes. Being resourceful and taking just what's needed, but yet be prepared for contingencies. So this will be, I'm going to say, a vacation. It will be compared to Bouvet and Desiccio, Navassa, Malpelo, those kind of places, because we have actual house to stay in. But it rains a lot there, and they say that Pitcairn has the world's most friendliest mud, which is clay. So if it rains, we'll have fun in the mud, I guess. But, this will be a gentleman's DXpedition compared to some that we've been on.
And there are no active hams on Pitcairn anymore, so this is one of the reasons for this DXpedition.
There are 3 or 4 licensed hams. We're taking some repairs, some parts for antennas to help them keep on the air. But Tom Christian was really the last of the very active hams. He and his wife, Brenda, I think, were very active. Meralda, VP6MW, has been on from time to time, but I don't think she's been on recently much. But anyway, we're taking some antenna parts for those who need some parts for their antennas.
Maybe leave some rigs there? When you think of Pitcairn, or at least the way that you're describing it, maybe it gets a supply ship every once in a while, and so ordering off the Amazon or the ham radio outlet catalog is not that easily done.
It can be easily done. It just doesn't get there. but now there's a supply ship starting, I think, this year that is there is there every 3 weeks, and there's actually on this ship there are 6 berths, so it's easy to go to Pitcairn for 2 to 3 weeks and stay in a home, and then go back on the next supply ship. So there are a lot of things that are changing. The population last month was 37. 37 permanent residents now live on Pitcairn. The highest population, I think, was in the about the 1900, might have been 190 people. But now it's down to 37. When the kids go away to school, of course, sort of like small towns in every country. In every country, the kids, once they go to school and see the world, they don't come back necessarily.
So we'll have to find out from you whether or not Pitcairn is going to be a holiday destination for the hams.
There's a lot of people that go there. When I was out in Visalia a month ago, there was a ham that came up to me and said, "I just got back from Pitcairn. I was there a couple of weeks. I didn't take a radio. I was there for some other studies, but I should have taken a radio," he said, "and gotten a license." But it's fairly easy now to go to Pitcairn and stay for a few days and return.
Well, it seems like perhaps somebody may put up the antennas and do an Airbnb so that you don't have to take the antennas with you. You can just take the rig.
Well, I'm sure that's going to happen. That would be really nice, wouldn't it?
That'd be really cool. So it's my understanding that you're semi-retired now. You're back in Iowa. What have you done to the QTH to make it amateur radio friendly? We
have 100 acres, just 98.6 acres to be exact, here at our QTH. And we're on top of a hill. And I spent about 3 years planning my station. So I have one tall rotating tower with a big 40-meter beam on top. My goal was to have a 200-foot tower with a big beam on top. But when you use HFTA to plan your antenna heights, boy, I was taken back. I don't need antennas that tall. So my 40-meter beam, I think, is about 160 feet, maybe 163 feet high. And then I have stepper antennas below that, spaced optimally for 20 meters. And I have a second tower for some fill-in for contesting. And I have a 4-square for 80 and I'll say a 2-square for 160. And my only regret is that I didn't start with a Foursquare for 160. I've acquired everything I need, and when I fully retire next year, that's my goal, is to finish a 160 Foursquare to help with contesting for and DXing for 160. So that's my only regret, and I have no regrets going with the Flex Radio system. It works so well and interfaces so well with the digital modes and with the contesting software I use. It's really, really cool.
What contesting software do you use?
I usually use N1MM. And for my general log, I use the old DX base. I still find that the most friendly for me. It's not the most modern. I've used log for OM, which was designed for Flex radios. And it's nice, but I have more data access with my previous QSOs with DXbase, so I've reverted back to DXbase after using log for OM a couple of years.
Now, you're in a rural area. What kind of internet do you have out there? How is it that we're talking?
Our driveway is 3/4 of a mile long. That's probably about a kilometer off of a dead-end road. So we have no visitors. We're very isolated. Of course, there's no fiber optic out here. And we are using what's called WiMAX. It's a wireless internet from a tower about 4 miles away. So that's our internet access. And our fastest download speed that I've seen is about 4.5 megabytes, and my highest upload speed is typically 1 megabyte, maybe 1.2 megabytes. So it's not the fastest, but it's very reliable. We've tried satellite, and when you want to see the weather, when the weather's bad, that's down. So this has been 100%. It's slow, but it's 100%.
Well, we just, when we started, we did a Skype video conference so I could show you the junk in my shack here. And the video is absolutely gorgeous. So, I think most people think that you have to have a big pipe. Usually a big pipe is for volume, not for speed. So it looks like WiMAX is the right product for you.
It's the only, that's really the only thing that, it's the only thing that will give us uninterrupted service.
Amazing. But you made some other modifications to your house that I read online. Do you want to describe what that modification was?
Yes, we're off the grid. We have 22.5 kilowatts of solar panels, and we have what we call our powerhouse. And in the powerhouse, we have the inverters and the battery storage, and we're capable of being totally off the grid forever, basically. We are connected to the grid because we produce more than we use, and we have our heat and air conditioning are electric, and that's how we burn up our credit. The power company, our co-op, will not buy back power, but they will give us credit kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour. So we burn up our credit that we've accumulated. And since we went live about 4 years ago, we haven't spent a dime on energy, and we're still accumulating credit. And if the power's down, there's a big relay that switches in the powerhouse, and we're on battery. And I know we do have our living room lights on the grid. That's our monitor light for whether or not we're on the grid. So when our living room lights go out and we look around and can't see anything, sometimes we get a little paranoid and we start shutting down our other lights. Uh-huh. But basically we're off the grid. Everything that we have powered, except for the living room lights, is capable of being powered by our batteries and off-grid system. We have some livestock, and so we need the power, for to power our well, so they get water. And I have a shop. I have some other hobbies. I do a lot of woodworking and some woodwork equipment, and I'll still be able to do that with the grids down.
Well, I think Iowa is in the Great American Desert in the Midwest there. Do you have sun most of the year?
We have a lot of sun. We have 4 seasons here. It's very green. It's not really desert. Maybe in population wise it is, but we have 4 good seasons here. Maybe sometimes the winter's a little bit too long, but we have very nice springs, except this spring where it's cold and rainy. we have very nice summers that aren't really terribly too hot, and we have beautiful falls here, some of the most beautiful in the world, I think. And my area of Iowa, in the very, very northeast corner, is called the driftless area because the last glaciers drifted around this area, and so it didn't smooth it off and make it flat. So we're kind of hilly, not mountains, but it's hilly.
I see, but during the winter, the clouds don't seem to reduce significantly your ability to generate electricity with your solar power.
No, not at all. And the colder it is, the more efficient solar panels are. And even with no sun for many days in December, we're good. I mean, we're good for a week if the world turns dark for 5 or 6 days, we're still good. And that will drain our batteries down to 50%. And I can, assuming there's gasoline, I can run a generator and recharge the batteries for another 3 or 4 days in about 4 or 5 hours. So, we're pretty self-sufficient as far as power and energy goes.
I understand you're also a beekeeper.
Yes, I keep just a few hives of bees. We have several acres of what's called pollinator crop. So it's basically 6 acres of wildflowers, and that's where my bees get their honey. So I have some pretty good wildflower honey, and it varies every year, but they're busy during the summer.
Do you use any amateur radio type high tech innovation to monitor your hives?
No, I don't. I'm a minimalist when it comes to beekeeping. A lot of guys are in their hives every week checking things, and I just peek in, and if they've filled a super with honey, I'll just add another 1 or 2, and 2 or 3 weeks later, I'll check again. So I'm not in and out of the hive a lot like a lot of guys are. And some people say that if you bother the bees, you lose a day or 2 of production. So I'm pretty minimalist when it comes to, I'll say, watching them. But it's fun to extract the honey and taste it each fall, because each hive has its own little flavors, because that hive has its favorites. And each year, the taste of the honey is generally different. It's a fascinating hobby.
It sounds amazing. I've got a beekeeper 2 doors down from me, so it seems to me, because of his hives right off the back, that perhaps we've got more flowering here happening, or more things. It seems like the bees and the flowers seem to go together.
Yeah, and as a beekeeper, you kind of learn to watch and be observant a little bit more of where the honey flow is or where the bees are going. Right now, I have about 50 fruit trees, and the bloom is just now finishing. And you could go out and buy one of the fruit trees in bloom, and you just hear this nice, happy hum. And now the dandelions are out, and pretty soon the wildflowers will be out. Some are already, but it's fun to see and watch the bees where they go.
What do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now?
Good question. I think it's replacement. The average age of the ARRL member is 68 years of age. And if you look at the checks that people give the year they were first licensed on sweepstakes, there's some pretty old checks. And, we're going to see fewer and fewer contesters as our ham population dies off, and we need to replenish that. And I'm back from the about 1950s when the novice license came out until the late 70s, maybe early 80s. There were a lot of kids or teenagers that became hams. And in the early 80s, mid 80s, we started to get computers. Internet came along, cell phones came along, and that's been a huge drain on the younger kids that are coming into our hobby. And somehow we need to get kids. And I've always been interested in youth, and I'm on the board of the Northern California DX Foundation, and I started where instead of giving out a scholarship with the ARL program, I worked with Tim Duffy, and we started a scholarship fund for Contest University and DX University. So anybody that's younger than 26 and maybe 30 will pay their tuition from NCDXF funds to go to Contest University and DX University, just to get younger kids in. And now you used to be able to only get letters, a letter sport in school for track or football or basketball, but now in a lot of schools you can letter in a sport called robotics. And I would love to see ham radio get involved, have varsity teams, school teams, with maybe an hourly contest each week, just like CW Test. And get kids involved that way, like in the STEM programs. And if you look carefully at some of the statistics, a lot of the new hams that are young are either from they're either homeschooled or have an Elmer in the family, like parents or grandparents or aunt or uncle that are hams, or the STEM schools. So I think getting into the education system early and promoting it as a varsity sport would be very successful. And now with instant feedback, we need real-time scoring, and this can be done now online. So I think getting all those things together would be our best way to help repopulate our dwindling population, our aging population.
So I floated this boat a couple of times. What do you think about when we were licensed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the average mortality age of American males was about 67 years old. Here we are, it's 2019. I was told by my physician that in Israel anyway, the average mortality rate age is 81. If we have a bunch of hams coming in their 30s, which it seems to be, this is what's happening, don't we kind of have our youngsters now for the next 50 years?
We do, but what are their numbers? I mean, they're coming in at that age, but are there as many? We had the magic. That's what got me started. Was the magic of radio, magic of communications that is taken for granted now. So we have a steep hill to climb to keep our numbers up. But there's a lot of older hams, and in the next 10 to 20 years, there's going to be a lot of silent keys. I was honored at Dayton this year to be able to give a eulogy for W0AIH Paul Bittner, and he was an absolutely fascinating guy. He was one of the most enthusiastic and Elmering guys I know. I mean, he was incredibly resourceful, had a sense of humor, and he defended his priorities. And he really got a lot of people started in contesting just because of his superstation. And, part of my talk was that, time is our enemy because it goes too fast and our friends are dying off. But it can also be our friend because, we can't reset the clock, but we can restart the clock and, set our priorities differently. Use our resourcefulness and enthusiasm, our Elmering, and, to bring new hams into our hobby. This eulogy that I gave at Dayton for Paul Bittner, W0AIH, I would travel with him, and he told me, I remember one time we were traveling, it was to Dayton, I think, we were laughing about funny epitaphs. And, there's some really funny ones out there. And he said, after a while, I want to be buried. He was a Lutheran pastor. I want to be buried with my Bible, my hymnal, and my key. And his favorite Bible passage was Isaiah 53 that tells of the coming Messiah. And after Dayton, I wrote down a little, it's not even really a poem, but it kind of rhymes a little bit. I wrote something down. I said, Paul, this should be your epitaph, but it's a little bit long. And he called me back 2 days later after he got it. And he was so excited, he could hardly talk. And he said, that's it. I'm going to put that on my tombstone. And sure enough, that epitaph is on his tombstone. And it says, a Bible, a hymnal, and a key, a passion for these three. The key is now silent, but Paul sings with the Savior of Isaiah 53. So that's what he has on his tombstone.
Oh, that's amazing. How about that? You were in Dayton last week when I think Contest University was being offered. Did you have any sense, or maybe you heard from Tim, whether there was a large number of kids there, or youngsters in the Contest University?
There were several there. I was not at CTU this year, so I didn't see the population makeup. But
well, you were at Dayton. What did you get a sense of the kids while you were there? I think that they had over 30,000 hams.
There were over 30,000, I heard, and there were a number of younger people, but there seems to be a lot of older people too.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think it's some of the new modes. I think Joe Taylor was perfect to get into the DX Hall of Fame with the new mode. If you look at Club Log, FT8 has accounted for more contacts added to Club Log than all other modes combined. And now there's FT4 that's in the experimental stage. And, this really helps at the bottom of the sunspot cycles. And it's found some new modes of propagation that we didn't know existed. We thought signals just straightly angled or refracted out from the ionosphere, above a certain muff. But we find that, there's some signals that are scattering downwards, even on the higher frequencies that are strong enough yet we can make contacts with FT8, but not with other modes. You can't hear them. So, some of these new modes are you're able to make contacts. Yes, you can't, communicate a volume of information, but just call signs and grid squares. You're still making contacts. And, some of those new things are, my daughter-in-law really likes FT8 because she has a limited antenna. When the kids are down for a nap, she'll get on the radio, make a few FT8 contacts, and go back to the kids. Even though she's busy, she can do that with a limited antenna and low power. So this will allow a lot of people now that are moving into restricted areas where you can't have antennas or big antennas. So I think some of these new modes are really stimulating a lot of new activity and continuing activity in ham radio.
Do you operate your flex station remote control?
Oh, I do all the time. One of my jobs is in Wisconsin, and I take my laptop or Maestro and it's just like being in the shack. And on my laptop, I have SSDR, so wherever I go, without even carrying a Maestro, I'm able to get on the radio and work the modes.
What advice would you give to new returning hams?
Get active, have fun. Don't worry about getting the latest and greatest radio. The better antenna you can get up, the better, as we've said earlier. And just being on the bands and trying to make contacts. And it's just get on the air.
Yeah, there you go. Glenn, I know it took us a long time to arrange this QSO today, but I'm so grateful and happy that you were able to squeeze me in between Bouvet and your activity with Pitcairn. Thank you very much for joining me, and that you have a successful DXpedition to Pitcairn there in October. So with that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's been fun chatting with you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Glenn. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W0GJ in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.